Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, Chapter 6, Halacha 6, and we're going to get into exemptions to the law of shchicha. Keep in mind that these are the agricultural laws of Eretz Yisrael for the produce of Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi David Gilbert from the yeshiva, who's on the phone listening in today, he brings up a good point. He says that, look, if people knew about these laws and it was widely taught, look, this is still the right of the poor person in Eretz Yisrael, and it's still the obligation of the farmer in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Shulchan Aruch and the Chazan Ish, they're all saying that, look, it doesn't apply today because poor people don't go collect it, don't go pick it up. And there's no obligation, as we learned before, to leave this to rot in the field, and there's no obligation to leave it for the animals. But if poor people were to start going to collect it, it's their right to go collect it in Eretz Yisrael. And look, you have a lot of vineyards around Eretz Yisrael, and could you collect, enough crop which would be your right and your halachic ownership, where you could make, a good number of bottles of wine for Shabbat, for many Shabbats for a year? Yeah, you could. So, look, maybe, one day people will start, doing this again. Torah has a note that the laws are forever. So, even though it's not fashionable for people to go and, go collect produce and go process it themselves, the laws are still there. Right now, since nobody's doing it, the farmer doesn't have to leave it, but should people decide to go do it, farmer has to go leave it. And so, poor people could theoretically, you can get olives and you can brine them yourself. It's not hard to do. You just put them in salt water. You could have a lot of preserved olives for months or years. So it could end up being significant. Anyway, we're going to talk about exemptions from the laws of shchicha. The Mishnah reads, standing grain saves both an adjacent sheaf and an adjacent standing grain, like an adjacent patch of standing grain, from becoming shchicha. But a sheaf does not save an adjacent sheaf nor adjacent standing grain from becoming shchicha. Now, we talked about something that's similar to this in Chapter 5. The case that we had before was if you have a patch of standing grain and it can fold over to another yet unharvested part of standing grain, the patch of standing grain is saved. Now, in the case of that Mishnah over there in Chapter 5, we mentioned that what happens if between the two you have a standing grain, you have a cut sheaf, and the sheaf is close to the standing grain that hasn't been harvested yet. You can fold over the patch of standing grain, and it can't touch the unharvested one, but it can touch the sheaf. The question over there was, will that sheaf save the patch of standing grain from becoming shchicha? And the answer was no, it would not. Now we're looking at the opposite case. We're looking at the case where the standing grain itself is going to save the sheaf. Okay, so the standing grain has a special halacha that's going to be a little bit different from the cut sheaf. Why? Because the cut sheaf is movable property and it's been separated from the earth, and the laws of movable property are different from non-movable property. So the law of standing grain is going to have a little bit different implication because it's still connected to the ground and it's still technically not movable property. So that's a big point to keep in mind. So let me read this Mishnah again, because again, we're talking about this opposite case of what we talked about yesterday. There's something special about standing grain being able to save because it is permanent, non-movable property. That's really going to be the key here. Standing grain, says the Mishnah, saves both an adjacent sheaf and an adjacent standing grain from becoming shchicha. But a sheaf does not save an adjacent sheaf nor adjacent standing grain from becoming shchicha. Keep in mind, we're talking about movable property versus not movable property. And as it says here, a sheaf does not save an adjacent sheaf or row of standing grain from becoming shchicha. So that's what we talked about in that other case in chapter 5, that a sheaf does not save standing grain. But standing grain will save a sheaf. This is a logical case of A goes to B, but B doesn't necessarily go to A. That's a key point to keep in mind. A lot of times people will think about things saying that it's being reflexive, that A goes to B and B goes to A. But that's not the case here logically. This is a case where A goes to B, but B does not go to A. So keep that in mind. Why would that be? Because one is movable property and one is not. Which standing grain is it that saves a sheaf from becoming shchicha, says the Mishnah. And it continues, says, any that is not, or that is itself not shchicha, even if only one stalk. So let's take a look at the Shenis Eliyahu for some explanation of this for this part. So as we were talking about before, the Rasha's point is that if a forgotten sheaf or forgotten standing grain is located near a sheaf, that is non-shchicha. In other words, the forgotten produce becomes shchicha nonetheless, and its proximity to the unforgotten sheaf does not save it. Okay, so the Rosh is pointing out that the scripture in the Gemara is going to actually going to show where the scripture is going to teach the ability to save is going to be unique to standing grain, and that is going to be Doraita. The Rosh is pointing out that the Gemara coming up is going to be teaching that this is Doraita, and we see here that even if you have a stalk of unforgotten grain and it's near a forgotten sheaf, it's going to save the forgotten sheaf. So, so common in the law, it wants to know what is the minimum, what is the maximum, right? What is the minimum measure for something? That's always going to be in the backdrop of every halacha. What is the minimum? What is the maximum? Yesterday we were talking about the maximum being for a grain stack, and that's going to be equivalent when you weigh out the grain of weighing about 90 pounds, and that comes out to 9,600 zuz, which is around 90 pounds. 90 pounds of grain, not including the straw, leaves, or the hay. So here we're looking at the minimum measure. What is the minimum measure of standing grain that can save even one stalk? That is the point of this Mishnah, is to let us know in the halacha what is the minimum measure. That could, hey, that's important because somebody could say, look, is it going to be the amount of, what I could grab by one handful? And the Mishnah is coming along to say, no, it's even one stalk. So that is the point, that even one stalk, if that one stalk is not shchicha, it can save a sheaf, which is shchicha. Again, you can see the difference between the weight in Jewish law between movable property and permanent property, and that is the point. That's why one stalk has the power to save a sheaf from becoming shchicha. Mishnah is going to discuss this fine point of this rule mentioned in the last Mishnah, that when somebody forgets 2 seah or more, that is not rendered shchicha. So we're going to go back to this grain stack, and we're going to go back to this idea of this 90 pounds of grain. Keep in mind, this is Doraita, because they're saying, hey, what is a grain sheaf from the last Mishnah, the last Gemara? And over there, they were saying that it's Doraita, that you can reach out your hand and take it. And so something that is a massive grain stack that has 90 pounds or more of grain, even attached to all this straw, that, by the way, is going to be a giant amount, and it's going to be far too big for somebody to grab with their hand. Let's get back to this say of cut grain because it wants to keep going into it. Okay, Mishnah reads, if a seah of cut grain and a nearby seah of standing grain that has not yet been cut were both forgotten, and similarly with regard to a tree, if a seah of detached fruit and a nearby seah of attached fruit were both forgotten, and similarly with regard to garlic and onions, they do not combine to qualify for the 2 seah exemption from shchicha. Rather, they belong to the poor. And that was the point that we had last time with Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was asking the sages, he says, okay, if I have a forgotten sheaf over here that is 1 seah, and I have a forgotten sheaf over here that's 1 seah, do they combine to make 2 seah? Does that combine to be saved? Because together, this is a 2 seah thing. Sages come along and say, no, not only is the answer no, but the logic is flawed. They do not combine. Again, now over there, you're talking about 2 movable things, and now they're asking the question, you have 1 movable thing and 1 thing that's permanent property that's attached, right? So in that case, you had 2 detached things that, the question was, do they add up, or does it have to all be together? The sages ruled, hey, these 2 seah things have to all be connected. It has to be part of it. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of halachot that we're going to get into in Masechet Hala, and also in Trumos, where these principles that things that are alike have to be. There's rules for connection. There's special rules for connection for things, particularly when you're going to get into grain piles that are mixed with mixed ownership. And, because you have some for the Goan, you have some for the farmer. And the issue over here is going to be whether they combine or not, if they're not connected. So that was the point of the sages yesterday, that, hey, they have to be connected. And so this 2 seah thing is where it's really 1, and all this stuff is connected. They were asking before, if it's disconnected and it's 2 piles that comes up to 2 seah, does that save it? Does that add up? The answer is no over there. Here, it's saying that if you have a seah of cut grain, which is detached, like what we had yesterday, and a nearby seah of standing grain that's not yet been cut, and they were both forgotten, and it's going to be the same for a tree or other things like onions, they do not combine to qualify for the 2 seah exemption, and they belong to the poor. So in that case, where you have 1 and 1, you have 1 that's movable and 1 that's attached. It says that they belong to the poor, and they do not combine. So that's a little bit different case, because you could come back and you could say, hey, wait a second, this one's permanent property. Maybe because it's permanent property, maybe it has a different status. So Mishnah comes and says no. Rabbi Yosei says, if the domain of the poor comes between them, they do combine, but if not, they do not combine. So let's take a look at this from the Mara Fulda. And here's what he says. He says, Rabbi Yosef maintains that detached produce can be combined with attached produce. In other words, the movable property can be attached to the non-movable property to make up a 2 seah unit of forgotten produce, thus preventing its allocation to the poor as shchicha, unless the domain of the poor comes between them. And Mara Fulda continues, said, understood simply, this means that if the attached and detached seahs are separated by produce that is allotted to the poor, such as leket or peah, then the attached and detached seahs cannot be combined. Thus, if there is fallen leket between the attached sheaf and the attached grain, or there is a fallen parrot between the attached grapes and the attached grapes, then the detached and attached portions do not combine to form a 2 seah unit. Otherwise, they do combine to form a 2 seah unit. So the Gemara a little bit later is going to explain Rabbi Yossi's words a little bit differently, but in any event, according to Rabbi Yossi, this exclusion from combining the detached and the attached produce only applies when part of the grain field or the vineyard interposes them, and the exclusion does not pertain to ordinary orchards or fields containing fruits and vegetables. The standing grain, being 90 seah, is significant. We've been talking about in this Mishnah a seah and a seah. Comes out to about 90 pounds. We had this Mishnah with Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai, and they were talking about forgetting a sheaf next to something that's attached to the ground and physically permanent. For instance, a wine vat or an olive press. Now, in this case, because it's attached to the ground, it doesn't have the status of movable property like the other sheaf. And basically, what Rabbi Yossi is coming to say is that the standing sheaves are significant enough where it will save the movable property sheaf that's next to it, unless there's leket or shkikha that's between them, in which case it will not save, and that it will not. In that case, they do not combine, and one will not save the other, and it will those fallen sheaves will fall to become property of the poor. But in the other case, basically what Rabbi Yossi is saying, because this is attached and because this is not movable property, because it's significant enough that it'll eventually come to be remembered when they come back to cut this significant amount of grain, and then because of that, it will save it. And that's the point of what Rabbi Yossi is saying. By the way, this other idea of this property of the poor that's already or has a potential to already be between the two, this thing imposed like being between the two, that this is basically going to say no, this is already now the property of the poor, and that this standing grain cannot save the other one now because the property of poor is already there. Effectively, this cut sheaf that got forgotten will basically connect with the property of the poor rather than, which is between now, right? You have three things in a row. You have the standing property, which belongs to, is fixed, that standing grain, 90 seah, or is about 90 pounds, one seah, and that is going to be next to property of the poor, and the property of the poor is going to be next to this forgotten sheaf that's been cut and now movable property. So effectively, because it's interposing, that it basically this and this connect so that it falls to the poor, and in the other case, this and this has nothing between it, so that it stays to the property owner because it's significant enough. And that's the point of what Rabbi Yossi is saying. The Gemara is going to read like this. The Gemara is going to provide a scriptural source for the Mishnah's first ruling that standing grain saves an adjacent forgotten sheaf from becoming shkikha. Rebbe says in the Gemara, it is written, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forgot a sheaf in the field, the verse applies the shkikha obligation to a sheaf that is surrounded by a field, meaning harvested land, but not to a sheaf that is surrounded by standing grain. So if you take a look in Devarim 24:19, which is where the part about shkikha is, it's going to point out that, well, here's what Rabbi Kanievsky says in his Beurim shiurim. It says that a sheaf in the field, when it's talking about what the Torah says, 24:19 Devarim, says it's meaning that the sheaf lying in the open ground on a harvested field. So this is going to exclude a sheaf surrounded by or next to standing grain that is not shkikha. So the Derech Hamuna, he's over there in chapter 5, 129, Vilna Goan's commentary is pointing out that while the verse does not indicate that the standing grain surrounding the sheaf must be non-shkikha, the logic dictates that grain that is itself shkikha and that does not save itself from becoming awarded to the poor cannot save something from being awarded to them. Thus, it is obvious, says the Vilna Goan, in order for the sheaf to be saved from becoming shkikha, the standing grain surrounding it must be non-shkichucha. So, the point is that, although the exclusion of something surrounded by standing grain is stated with regards to forgotten sheaves, it also applies to forgotten standing grain, since the two laws are mentioned in the same verse. So they are, linked by a hekesh and therefore analogous, and therefore the Mishnah is ruling that standing grain saves both an adjacent sheaf and an adjacent standing grain from becoming shchicha. That's why they're both there. So the Mishnah stated that only standing grain saves adjacent produce from becoming shchicha, but a sheaf does not save adjacent produce from becoming shchicha. The Gemara is going to wonder why the preceding explanation does not exclude shchicha even when it's near a non-shchicha sheaf. And this is what we were talking about in the 5th chapter. Remember, we were talking about A goes to B doesn't necessarily go to A, and this is the case of B not necessarily going to A. Why is it that the forgotten sheaf that is surrounded by non-shchicha sheaves is considered shchicha, while a forgotten sheaf that is surrounded by non-shchicha standing grain is not shchicha? That is, what we were talking about, over there. That this cut sheaf that's between the that's between standing grain and standing grain is not going to save the standing grain is not going to save the sheaf. Okay, the standing grain. Okay, so when we were talking about this open field, that's going to be a key point to try to understand. The Gemara is going to answer. The Gemara reads, in the case of a sheaf that is surrounded by non-shchicha sheaves, what is beneath those sheaves is a field. But in the case of a sheaf surrounded by non-shchicha standing grain, what is beneath that grain is straw. In other words, it's not a field. So the Pnei Moshe is pointing out that just as we explain in the field as open, as excluding a sheaf that is surrounded by or adjacent to non-shchicha standing grain, let us explain it as excluding a sheaf that is surrounded by non-shchicha sheaves. So the Marafulda is going to point out that the following, right? So when you have a forgotten sheaf that is surrounded by other non-shchicha sheaves, the surrounding field has already been harvested and is in essence an open ground. And the fact that the sheaves are lying on this open ground does not alter its classification as a field. Therefore, the forgotten sheaf is considered a sheaf in the field and subject to shchicha. So that, by the way, is the first terminology thinking of the Torah. Torah is talking about in the field. And so even if you cut the stuff, it's still a field and it's laying on top of a field. So that is the point there. But by contrast, says the Marafulda, when a forgotten sheaf is surrounded by non-shchicha standing grain, the land beneath the grain is not open ground, but rather land filled with stalks of that grain. And therefore, the sheaf is not considered a sheaf in the field and is excluded from becoming shchicha. Basically, the point is that under the ear of wheat is hay, and so that ear of wheat is sitting on top of hay, and the hay is part of the field. That's basically what it means, right? So it's reading the Torah is saying that it has to be on the field, and it's saying that, well, actually it's not on the field, it's on hay, even though it's standing, right? That's the point. And you could look at it that way. Each ear of grain is sitting on top of hay, not sitting on top of a standing field. Let's take a look at what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says. In his Beurim in Seif 134, here's what he says about this. He says, by stating that shchicha applies specifically to a sheaf that is surrounded by harvested land, the Gemara implies that as long as there is no swath of harvested land separating the sheaves from the standing grain, the sheaf is deemed adjacent to the standing grain and is saved by it. The precise distance between them is not a factor. So the Rambam mentions something in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 5:21, and over there he's stipulating that the forgotten sheaf or forgotten grain must be adjacent to non-shchicha grain and not surrounded by harvested land. So over there in chapter 5 of Peah in Halacha 2, we were talking about forgotten standing grain, and it was talking about a leniency. And over there, it was saying that, even if it's surrounded by a swath of harvested land, if the swath is long enough to reach the non-shchicha grain, such that it can be cut together with that grain, it's going to be saved from becoming shchicha. Over here, now we're talking about this sheaf that is already cut and is movable property, and whether that's going to save it. And so this is not going to be the same law as what we have in chapter 5 halacha 2. There's no contradiction at all, by the way. It's just that A goes to B, B does not go to A. So, over here we're talking about how a sheaf does not save an adjacent sheaf, and a sheaf does not save standing grain from becoming shchicha. Standing grain can save a sheaf, but a sheaf cannot save standing grain. Don't think that it's reflexive, because you can have a case where the standing grain is too far from other standing grain, and you have a sheaf between it, and you want to know, hey, is this sheaf going to save the standing grain? And in that case, it will not. So that's a key point. Standing grain can save other standing grain because it's attached produce, it's attached property, it's not movable. But the halacha in every case is going to be that movable property is going to have a lower distinction and a lower value than attached and real and permanent property. So there's going to be a baraisa that's very similar, and the Gemara reads like this. It says, it was taught in a baraisa, the standing grain of one's fellow that is non-shchicha saves one's own adjacent produce from becoming shchicha. That, by the way, is the Tosefta in 3:11, which we mentioned before. And in chapter 5, the Gemara continues, says, the standing grain of a non-Jew saves the adjacent produce of a Jew from becoming shchicha, and standing grain of wheat that is non-shchicha saves adjacent produce of barley from becoming shchicha. These are the words of Rebbe. But the sages say only one's own non-shchicha grain saves his forgotten produce from becoming shchicha, and only produce of its own kind saves forgotten produce from becoming shchicha. So the point over here is that, the Torah says in Beurim 24:19, when you reap the harvest of your field, and it implies that one's own unharvested field saves his forgotten produce from becoming shchicha. Moreover, this phrase field is going to mean an area in which the same kind of produce is sown. So why don't we pause for today, and we'll continue next time. Then the Mishnah is going to go rule that the non-shchicha standing grain saves both the forgotten sheaves and the forgotten standing grain, whereas the non-shchicha sheaf saves neither. Again, keep in mind, movable property, not movable property. The Gemara cites a baraisa that presents other options regarding this matter. Sugya reads, it was taught in a baraisa, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, just as standing grain that is non-shchicha saves a nearby sheaf that was forgotten from becoming shchicha, so too a sheaf that is non-shchicha saves nearby standing grain that was forgotten from becoming shchicha, and this is supported by the logic of a kal v'chomer. Gemara reads, for if even standing grain in which the interests of the poor have been expanded, in other words, inasmuch as they're entitled not only to the shchicha but also to the leket and the peah as well, it can save, says the Gemara, can save a nearby sheaf from becoming shchicha. Then, in regard to a sheaf in which the interests of the poor have been limited, inasmuch as they are entitled only to the shchicha but not to leket or peah from it, is it not logical that it should be able to save adjacent standing grain from becoming shchicha? That's the question. So over here, Rabban Shimon Gamliel is disputing this Mishnah's ruling that a non-shchicha sheaf can save neither a sheaf nor standing grain. This is going to be a disagreement between Rabban Shimon Gamliel and Rebbe, and we're going to get into this. Basically, what he's asking, says the Rosh, is that although the poor person has broad rights in standing grain works against the poor in that it saves the owner's forgotten sheaf from becoming awarded to them as shchicha. Keep in mind, we were asking in the last Gemara, actually, it was Rabban Gamliel also asking, well, who does the law favor? It's supposed to favor the field owner, the owner, not favor the poor. The poor does have a right to things, but when trying to interpret it, we're supposed to favor the landowner. So over here, the Rosh is pointing out that point that the standing grain works against the poor. So over here, we have a comment by the Rosh to help us explain it, where it's saying that, a sheaf which is less friendly to the poor than standing grain should work against them and save the adjacent produce from being awarded to them as shchicha. Note that Rabban Shimon Gamliel is comparing two cases that are opposites, both in regards to the item that affects and saves in regards to the item being saved. So he states that since standing grain saves a sheaf, logic dictates that a sheaf should save standing grain. And his kal v'chomer deals specifically with the item affecting the save, because it states that since standing grain has the capacity to save, surely a sheaf must have the capacity to save as well. The kal v'chomer does not address the item being saved, and that basically is going to be the rebuttal. So the Gemara continues with the dissent. The dissent is by Rebbe. Gemara reads like this, says, Rebbe said to Rabban Shimon Gamliel, this kal v'chomer argument is not completely valid. It says, what is the comparison to the law that non-shchicha standing grain saves an adjacent sheaf from becoming shchicha? Gemara continues, says, that rule is logical since the interests of the poor have been limited in the sheaf. In other words, inasmuch as it's not subject to leket or peah, so when the forgotten item is something in which the poor has limited rights, the reason should dictate that it should be saved from being awarded to them as shchicha. Gemara continues, says, shall we therefore say that a non-shchicha sheaf saves adjacent standing grain when the interests of the poor have been expanded in the standing grain, inasmuch as it is subject even to leket and peah? In other words, let's take a look at the Mara Fulda here for an explanation. In other words, since the forgotten item is something in which the poor enjoys greater rights, reason dictates that it should be less readily be saved and should sooner be awarded to them as shchicha. So how can you argue that a non-shchicha sheaf must be able to save forgotten standing grain from becoming shchicha? That's a good question. Mara Fulda continues with his explanation and saying that as explained, both Tanaim agree that a sheaf is less friendly to the poor than standing grain. We know that from last Mishnah. They disagree only about whether we must focus specifically on the item affecting the save or on the item to be saved. Thus, when the item affecting the save and the item are to be saved are sheaves, both Tanaim will agree that the forgotten item is spared from being rendered shchicha. So it emerges that Rabban Shimon and Rebbe both dispute the Mishnah's ruling that a sheaf does not save another sheaf from becoming shchicha. We're going to continue on this from the Rosh Cirillo to help us to get another insight on this next Gemara. So the Gemara is gonna note there's 2 points regarding these Tanaim agreeing, okay, and here's what it is, okay. From the words of both of them, Rabban Shimon Gamliel, we may learn that in their opinion, a forgotten sheaf is saved from becoming shchicha by an adjacent sheaf that is non-shchicha, and forgotten standing grain is not saved from becoming shchicha by adjacent standing grain that is non-shchicha. In these points, Rabban, Shimon Gamliel, and Rebbe agree. And as we were mentioning, with Mara Fulda, the point is that there's a dispute in the Mishnah, and they disagree only about whether the forgotten standing grain is saved from becoming shchicha by an adjacent non-shchicha sheaf. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that it is saved, and Rebbe holds it is not saved. So Rosh Cirillo is explaining like this. It says, Rabban Shimon Gamliel maintains that all depends on the nature of the item affecting the save, and thus holds that a sheaf in which the poor has limited rights can save anything from becoming shchicha. Rebbe maintains that we must consider the nature of the item that is to be saved, and he holds that the standing grain in which the poor have expanded rights cannot be saved by anything from becoming shchicha. So he continues to point out that the Tana of our Mishnah rules that standing grain will save both a sheaf and standing grain, but a sheaf saves neither a sheaf nor standing grain. That, by the way, is what we talked about in Chapter 5, Halacha 2. Again, A goes to B, B doesn't necessarily go to A. In other words, that standing grain will save a sheaf, but a sheaf will not save standing grain. So so Rosh Cirillo is saying that this Tana rejects the assertion that standing grain is more friendly than sheaves of the poor. For actually, to the contrary, we find that standing grain is exempted from shchicha as long as it has the potential to produce 2 seyas of kernels, whereas the sheaf is not exempted unless it actually contains 2 seya. So let's just take a look at the Vilna Goan, and he has a different reading of this brisa, this dispute, and it's always interesting to see what Vilna Goan says about this. Here's what he says. He says, regarding the brisa and the debate between Rabban Shimon Gamliel and Rebbe, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's Kal V'chomer goes as follows, says the Vilna Goan. If even standing grain, in which the poor can have expanded interests, can save standing grain from becoming shchicha, as stated in the Mishnah, then surely a sheaf in which the poor has limited interests can save standing grain from becoming shchicha. Thus, in both parts of the Kal V'chomer, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel deals with a case in which the item being saved is standing grain. The Kal V'chomer states simply that a sheaf can save it no less than standing grain can. So that's going to be different from what we learned. Again, Vilna Gaon's not saying that he agrees with this. He's only pointing out the logic and the point behind Rabban Gamliel's idea here. Okay, he's saying his Kal V'Chomer should be that the sheaf can also save standing grain. We know that that's not the case. Rebbe counters, says the Vilna Goan, that this Kal V'Chomer is valid if we consider a sheaf less friendly to the poor than standing grain. Then we ought to take a step further and explain it as follows. If even standing grain, in which the poor has expanded interest, can be saved by a sheaf from becoming shiurim, then surely a sheaf in which the poor have limited interest should be saved by a sheaf from becoming shiurim. But Rebbe argues unspokenly, says the Vilna Goan, you surely concede that a sheaf cannot be saved by another sheaf. Rebbe apparently considers this self-evident. Therefore, we must conclude that the Kal V'Chomer is not valid, and the laws of saving from shchicha are not based on these considerations of expanded or limited interest. Thus, there is no basis to argue that even a sheaf can save standing grain from becoming shchicha. So, according to the Vilna Goan, the Gemara comments that from the words of both Tanaim, we may infer that one sheaf cannot save another sheaf from becoming shchicha, and Rebbe assumes the law to be self-evident to the extent that he relies upon it as the basis for refuting Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's Kal V'Chomer, and whatever Gamliel's reasoning is, he does not disagree with the point. He's basically saying that the second law cannot be inferred from it. So, according to the text, says the Vilna Goan, that Rebbe agrees that the Tana of our Mishnah agrees with the Tana of the Mishnah that standing grain saves both the sheaf and the standing grain, but a sheaf saves neither the sheaf nor the standing grain. So there are only two opinions by the Tanaim. There's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who maintains that standing grain can save both a sheaf and standing grain, and the sheaf can save standing grain but not another sheaf. And then there's the view of the Rebbe and the Tana of the Mishnah, holding that standing grain can save anything while a sheaf cannot save anything. So that is the insight by the Vilna Goan. Let's take a look at what the Rambam says. Rambam says in Hilchos Matanas Aniyim, he rules in accordance with the rabbis that two sheaves do not combine to qualify for a two-seah exemption, and Rambam still finds it necessary to cite this Mishnah's ruling that detached and attached produce do not combine for the two-seah exemption. And the implication is that the Rambam considers the Mishnah's ruling compatible with the view of the sages, which, by the way, as we just saw, seems to be a contradiction to the Yerushalmi. So that's an interesting insight. You can get more commentary on this, by the way, from Beurim and Moshe Feinstein's Beurim on Safe 135. Let's continue. So the Mishnah was describing when you have standing grain saving a sheaf from becoming shiurim, and it says that any that is itself not shiurim, even if it's only one stalk. And going back to this minimum measure, what is the minimum measure for this? We want to know how much is too much, or how much is not enough, or what is it? What is it? It's one standing grain. This implies, says the Gemara, that only standing grain that is presently not shiurim saves an adjacent forgotten sheaf, but if the owner subsequently forgot the standing grain as well, the sheaf will become shiurim at that point. So this goes back to this question in Peah, chapter 5, Halacha 2, as to whether a forgotten sheaf that was saved from becoming shiurim by the closeness of non-shiurim standing grain becomes shiurim when that standing grain is itself forgotten. That's basically what it's saying. And the proof is going to be deflected. And here's what the Gemara says. It says, do we not infer that if one subsequently forgot the standing grain, the sheaf is rendered shiurim at that time? Rather, interpret the Mishnah as excluding a sheaf from becoming saved only in a case where one forgot the standing grain first before forgetting the sheaf, such that the sheaf was never saved in the first place. So the Mara Fulda says that the Mishnah does not mean that only standing grain, which is presently non-shichicha, can save a sheaf from becoming shichicha. Rather, it means that any standing grain that is non-shichicha, when the sheaf is initially forgotten, saves it from becoming shichicha at any point in time. The only case in which the sheaf that is adjacent to standing grain becomes shichicha is one in which the standing grain was rendered shichicha before the sheaf was forgotten, so that it was never able to save the sheaf in the first place. And this interpretation since this interpretation is possible, the inquiry cannot be resolved on the basis of this Mishnah. That's what the Mara Fulda points out. So Mara is going to continue. It's going to say that the Mishnah stated further that a seah of cut grain and a seah of standing grain do not combine to qualify for the two seah exemption from shchicha. Rather, they belong to the poor. Gemara is going to remark on that and say that, but if both of the one seah units were cut and there were two seah sheaves adjacent to one another, they would combine for the exemption and would belong to the owner. Thus, the Mishnah accords with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, who ruled for the previous Mishnah in chapter 6, Halacha 5, that two forgotten sheaves combine to qualify for two seah exemption of shichicha. We know that that is not the halacha, but according to the sages who ruled in the last Mishnah, the one seah sheaves do not combine for this exemption, and our Mishnah is specifying the cut seah and the not cut seah for another reason. I want to point out some commentary that, again, I think that it's necessary for the Mishnah to put in before in the last Mishnah we were talking about cut, and will that add up? And here we're talking about cut and not cut. Will it add up to this two seah thing, this 90 pounds of grain? And again, the property rights for movable property for a sheaf and attached produce, which is still technically, permanent property. It's fixed property. These are two different ownership, and they have two different statuses in halacha. So the question is put there saying that, hey, will this different ownership structure and different entitlement structure between movable and not movable, will that add up? That's why it's in here. So the Gemara is going to now move on, and it's going to talk about cut grain, uncut grain. And, we were talking about this before in chapter 5, Halacha 2, and it was asking over there whether, if you forgot a sheaf that was saved from becoming shichicha by its closeness to the non-shichicha standing grain, it becomes shichicha when the grain that itself is itself forgotten, or is it going to remain, saved permanently? Now, the Gemara is going to try to resolve this question on the basis of this Mishnah's ruling that a forgotten seah of cut grain, in other words, one seah sheaf, and forgotten seah of uncut grain, whether it's going to combine for this two seah exemption. And this resolution is going to be based on this understanding that the Mishnah is referring to a case where these two units were forgotten in the order in which they're mentioned. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. In other words, first you have the sheaf, and that's forgotten first, and then the standing grain, that's forgotten second. And when the owner is initially forgetting the sheaf, but he had not forgotten the standing grain that's next to it, that hasn't been forgotten yet, the sheaf was saved by the standing grain from becoming shchicha. But now when the standing grain is forgotten, in other words, the order is switched, and the standing grain is forgotten first, the question is, is it going to combine? By stating that the standing grain is forgotten, it does not combine with the forgotten sheaf for the two Saya exemption. The Mishnah is going to imply that the sheaf is rendered shkika at that point. And that's the point of this Mishnah coming up, this Gemara coming up, sorry. We're gonna look at the Beurim by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on Safe 103 for some help on this. Here's what it says. Here's what the Gemara says. It says, but if something that was initially saved permanently, then let the cut grain, in other words, the sheaf, still be saved on account of the uncut grain. Now, again, we're looking at order here. Pay attention to the order. So the first thing to be cut here, the first thing to be forgotten was the cut grain, and the second thing to be saved in this Mishnah is the uncut grain. And, according to that case, even the uncut grain itself, even after the uncut grain itself is forgotten, why is the Mishnah considering the sheaf shkika? That's the question. And the Gemara is gonna answer. It's gonna continue. It's to say, this tells us that if there is something that is fit to be saved from becoming shkika on account of its closeness to the non-shkika grain, and the reaper subsequently forgot it again, when it no longer has this shkika in its proximity, it is rendered shkika at that time. So here's what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says about this. He says, granted that the one seah sheaf and the seah of standing grain do not combine to qualify for the two seah exemption, the sheaf should nonetheless remain the owner's on account of having been saved when it was initially forgotten. That's the point of what this is basically asking and replying to. In other words, saying Rabbi Moshe Feinstein saying that one seah sheaf, here for the cut and non-cut, they don't qualify. But the question is, when was it initially forgotten? And the sheaf should belong to the owner, depending on when it was initially forgotten, depending on the order. In other words, it's saying, if there's something that, is fit to be saved, then, depending on the order of when it's forgotten, perhaps, this is being saved. So let's take a look at the Mara Fulda to clear it up. Gemara mentions here another case that is governed by this question. The question has two cases. You have the standing grain that affected the save, is itself forgotten. So the standing grain will save something, and now that which is saving something, now that got forgotten. That's one part of the question. Okay. The second part of the question is that the standing grain is reaped, and at that time, the forgotten sheaf is overlooked. So in either case, the forgotten sheaf is no longer has any non-shkika in its closeness, its proximity, that can save it, says Mara Fulda, and the question explores whether it remains saved. In other words, it's really asking, it's saying, hey, if this at one point was saved, does this saved status continue and continue to save even after it was forgotten? Because at one point it was saved. That's what it's saying. So Mara Fulda continues, says, our Mishnah is, as currently understood, deals with the first case. A one seah sheaf was forgotten in proximity to a seah of standing grain, and then the standing grain was also forgotten. And since the Mishnah treats the sheaf as shkika, the Gemara is inferring that in the related case where the standing grain was reaped and the sheaf again overlooked, the sheaf would also become shkika. In any event, says the Mara Fulda, we see from the Mishnah that something saved from becoming shkika initially can become shkika at a later time when the circumstances changed. So why is this being brought up? It's being brought up to see, hey, in these other cases where you have permanent, fixed property and you have movable property, if one was forgotten and then the other was not forgotten, and then it comes to be uh, forgotten later, will it have this status of being saved in the case of the fixed property? So the question really here is, if you have movable property next to fixed property, and the fixed property, you forgot the movable property first, and then you forgot the fixed property after, so that the fixed property was saving the sheaf, so it wasn't forgotten. And then after the fact, so you have this forgotten sheaf that is basically saved because the fixed property is saving it, and that has a different status, that has a power to save. So the question is, if you come back and it's still attached and now you forgot the fixed one, is that going to have the power to save? That's really, I think, the question of what it's trying to get at. So in this, you always have these two things going on. You have the fixed produce, and you have the one that's not fixed, and the movable and the not movable. And so the question is, on the one that's fixed, if you have an initial forgetting, is it going to have the power to be saved because it's fixed? That's really the deeper part of the question. And this resolution that was just asked is going to be rejected. Rabbi Yonah said, interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where one first cuts the entire row of standing grain and then removes the sheaves of the entire row. And it deals with a case where he already forgot to cut the standing grain before he forgot to remove the sheaves. In other words, this is a case where the standing grain gets culled out, so it's a patch of standing grain, and that got forgot first. Now, that is the fixed property that gets forgotten first, and it's, according to Rabbi Yonah, it's dealing with a case where the sheaves are forgotten after. So the sheaves are the movable property. So let's take a look at the Mara Fulda here for an explanation, and saying that he cut the entire row of grain, but he left a patch, and then when he returned to bind the cut grain into sheaves and remove them, he left one of the sheaves behind, near the patch of the standing grain. Since the standing grain was forgotten first, it is rendered shchicha immediately. When the sheaf is subsequently forgotten, there is no shchicha standing grain in its proximity that can save it from becoming shchicha. That's the point of what Rabbi Yonah is saying. It's the order in which it's forgotten. Now, if the sheaf was forgotten first, before the standing grain would be able to save it. That's what the Mishnah is saying. So Marafuld is pointing out that the Mishnah informs us that although both the standing grain and the sheaf are now forgotten, they do not combine for the Tusei exemption for shchicha. Rather, both of them belong to the poor, because it's when the order of them, when it was forgotten, happens. They don't combine because one was forgotten first, and that was only one seah, and then the other one was forgotten, that's only one seah. They don't combine because when the first one was forgotten, it was only one seah, not two seah. So that's the point of what Mara Fulda is explaining, what Rabbi Yonah is saying. Mishnah stated, and this finishes up this halacha. Mishnah stated, Rabbi Yossi said, if the domain of the poor comes between them they do not combine, but if not, they do combine. So the domain of the poor is referring to leket and peret, which are entitlements to the poor, and the Gemara is inquiring as to this precise meaning of Rabbi Yossi's clause. Gemara reads, what does Rabbi Yossi mean? Does he mean that detached and attached produce combine for the Tusei exemption unless the domain of the poor actually comes between them? In other words, there's fallen leket ears or fallen parrot grapes lying on the ground between the detached and attached produce? Or, says the Gemara, does it mean that even if the domain of the poor is merely capable of coming between them, they do not combine? In other words, whenever there is a potential for leket or parrot to fall there, for there is standing grain or there are grapes on the vine between the detached and attached produce, it prevents them from combining for the exemption. Rosh Cirillo says, to explain this, says according to the second part of the inquiry, Rabbi Yossi holds that even if there's no actual leket or parrot between the detached and attached produce, they do not combine as long as grain from which leket can fall can interpose between them. So it has the potential to. So this is a question. They're trying to understand what is the limit of it. Does it mean that the property of the poor, this entitlement, has to physically be between it now? Or does it mean that this is an ongoing process that's going through time and they're doing it and it has the potential where there's other things that could fall between it? Hasn't fallen yet, but it can because all this other stuff is being worked on, and that's why it's going to be able to connect. The Gemara is going to resolve this question, and it's going to be asking basically at what point is it going to be fit, in other words, to combine or not combine. So Gemara reads, let us learn the resolution from the following brisa, in which Rabbi Yossi explains his ruling, quoted in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi said, whenever the domain of the poor, such as a grain field or a vineyard, comes between the detached and attached produce, they do not combine for the two say exemption. Now, in the case of a vineyard, the domain of the poor, in other words, the actual leket, is not there immediately at the beginning of the harvest, for it often takes some time for parrot to fall. So this tells us in effect, says the Gemara, that even if the domain of the poor is merely fit to come between detached and attached produce, they do not combine. So let's take a look at the Vilna Goan's explanation and help us to try to understand it. So according to this reading of the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi does not mean that the Mishnah, that's the wrong part. So the Derech Hamuna is saying that okay. So, all right. So Rabbi Yossi here in the Brisa, Rabbi Yossi is mentioning specifically a grain field or a vineyard, indicating that the domain of the poor refers to the potential to acquire leket or peah. The Tosfot on Yom Tov wonders why the domain of the poor does not also include the potential to acquire peah, which would make it possible for the rule of imposition to apply to all fields and orchards, which are subject to the peah requirements, not only grain in vineyards. So Rabbi Yossi's point is that the potential of these things to fall between them in this work process matters. And even if it's not physically there yet, things are going to fall in this work process that do belong to the poor. And that's the point. The Mishnah is saying that Rabbi Yossi says if the domain of the poor comes between them, they do not combine. But if not, they do combine. So if the domain of the poor comes between them or has the potential to fall and come between them, they do not combine. So Rabbi Yossi is basically having the position that detached produce can be combined with attached produce to make up a 2 seah unit of forgotten produce. And it will prevent its allocation to the poor as shchicha unless the domain of the poor comes between them. And even if it has the potential to fall and come between them, okay, that's what this Gemara is saying, that that will still be the domain of the poor, and it will still go to the poor. And if it doesn't have that potential to go there, or it's not actually there, it's going to go to the property of the owner instead. In other words, this is meaning that if the attached and detached sayas are separated by produce that is allocated to the poor, like leket, then the attached and detached saya cannot combine. And if the fallen leket between the detached sheaf and the attached grain is there, then the detached and attached portions do not combine to form a two saya unit. Otherwise, they do combine to form a two saya unit. Look, I know that this is complicated, but in the real world, farmers farm, and some of these laws still do apply in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, all the Meiser Ani still applies. Also, people are not out picking up this stuff, but if they were to be out picking this stuff up, then all this stuff would apply. If that became like a custom for people to pick up produce like in the old days, but they are entitled to it. So we want to understand the finer points of halacha because we want to go after this point from the Chazan Ish on why it's so important to study all the aspects of the law. Thank you so much.